Good morning and welcome. Good morning, everybody. We hope you're here for a great conversation on micromobility, maximum equity. My name is Jamie Ponce with the City Tech Collaborative, and I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. So again, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. We know that there's a lot happening outside. We know that there are a few conversations happening in parallel, but we think this one is really addressing a critical issue that continues to come up throughout the Smart Cities Atlanta's conference. Micromobility through the lens of maximum equity. Like I mentioned before, my name is Jamie Ponce. I direct strategic partnerships with the City Tech Collaborative. We're a Chicago-based organization that is reinventing cities through new ideas, technology, IoT, cyber-physical solutions, and probably most importantly, collaborative innovation. And to us, that means bringing together all of the stakeholders from local government to academia to corporations to startups to community groups and residents to address the really big issues facing cities. We focus on problems of public need and business opportunity, where we know that technology is a part of the solution, but that the pieces won't put themselves together on their own. A lot of us talk about cross-sector collaboration like it's theology or religion, and to some extent it is, but it's also very practical. And particularly as you begin to wrestle with problems and opportunities like urban mobility, we realize that the problems we're facing are much bigger than any single organization, bigger than any single sector. And it really takes not just strategic alignment, but economic alignment, and also the nuts and bolts of collaboration to really come up with practical solutions to improve economic vitality, quality of life in our nation's cities, in the world's cities. Which leads us right into urban transportation. It fits that definition perfectly of big problems that require all of the brains, all of the technology, all of the tools, the resident engagement and input that we can get to create these vibrant, livable cities. Coordinating an urban transportation system has never been easy, but particularly today with the influx of new modes and technologies and resident needs and an influx of data, this proliferation of technology and innovation is really increasing the challenge of coordinating a functional transportation system. But the core goal of urban transportation has always been the same, whether it was horses and buggies or private vehicles and public transportation, buses, trains, docked shared vehicles, dockless shared vehicles. It all boils down to getting people and goods to where they need to be as effectively, efficiently, and safely as possible. This has really become a sweeping challenge that's impacting cities, residents, and companies in entirely new ways, but I'm very pleased to be here this morning with experts from multiple sectors and multiple leaders in the urban transportation arena. So I'd really like to kick off this conversation with introductions of each of our panelists. We're joined here by public officials with Alderman Gilbert Villegas, Brandon Pollock joining us from Bird, and Colin Tooze from Uber New Mobility. And as I invite you to introduce yourselves, to start us out, I'd really like to ground the conversation in residents and consumers. And Alderman Villegas, in leading the 36th Ward in the city of Chicago, you're really on the front lines when it comes to interacting with your residents, your constituents, hearing from them about their needs to get to the places they need to be to work and play and back and forth to home. Tell us a little bit about your ward, the constituents you serve, and their mobility needs and reactions to some of the changes.
Thank you, Jaime. 36th Ward, northwest side of the city, approximately 60,000 residents that live in the territory. And where the ward is structured, there's good public transportation, but as it relates to like the highways, we're kind of in the middle. So allowing for electric scooters, e-bikes is very important as we try to complete that last mile for those constituents that are coming from public transportation, whether they're trying to do some local groceries, just go to the store. So I think those types of modes of transportation are very important in an urban setting. And so what we're seeing is these new technologies coming out, taking a look at rolling it out through a pilot program, kind of measuring it. And I can say that based off just the pilot program that we've got in place right now, tens of thousands of rides have been completed, and there's a lot of excitement. And then there's some issues as well, as constituents talk about where these scooters are at and stuff like that. So it's about educating them and letting them know that these are for those constituents that have that hard time of completing that last mile.
Thank you, and welcome, Alderman. Next, I'd like to introduce Brandon Tooze, who directs public affairs for new mobility at Uber. And Colin, I know that you've been with Uber now for 5 years, which has been a wild ride, I'm sure, in every sense of it. Can you talk a little bit about your role, how Uber approaches new mobility, and how Uber's engagement in the policy sphere has evolved, especially with the advent of new modes and micromobility?
Sure, thank you for that. Yeah, I've had a front row seat to a company that has changed dramatically over the last 5 years. I think for the better, from top to bottom. Our current leadership is 100% focused on a goal of making the company be the world's first true multimodal platform. And that means offering the ability to move through a city however residents in those cities are looking to get from A to B. And that'll look very different in Bangalore from, say, Baltimore. And so I think an openness to whatever modes can help people leave the car at home, go from being a 2-car household to a 1-car household, or ditch the car entirely. I think it has enormous potential to benefit society, benefit residents, and improve their quality of life and their well-being. And from a micromobility perspective, I think scooters and bikes are what today, are today's answer to that question, and have exciting possibilities on their own. I think if we're having this conversation a year from now, there may be, given the pace of product development in this space, I think there will be even more new and interesting modes to talk about. And from Uber's perspective, we want to be open to understanding where the demand is and meet people where they are, so that we're providing a reliable and an affordable alternative in cities throughout the world.
Thank you. Welcome, Colin. And Brandon Pollock is the Director for Global Civic Engagement and Strategy at Bird, which is part of this new mobility constellation that cities are facing. Brandon, please share a little bit about your work, and if you could, maybe preview some of the policy arenas or policy issues that are really shaping Bird's business and e-scooter rollouts in cities across the country.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So, Bird was the first, we have had the ability to start this e-scooter revolution. And it's kind of funny because it hasn't even been 2 years yet that our company started. And so, year and a half ago, even some cases a year ago in a lot of places, when I started in the company, we weren't even having these conversations. We weren't really, we were still talking about, docked bike share. We were even talking about dockless bikes, obviously e-bikes. But certainly now, this whole kind of connectivity, all these different modes are changing, and we're having a totally different conversation, which I think is exciting. And I know cities are getting more and more excited about the opportunity, especially when they're tackling major issues in their cities. Congestion is obviously, one, people are sick of riding in cars, and 40% of people drive their car in under 3 miles and less. And so we've kind of found a sweet spot, right? Kind of our goals, as I said, eliminating congestion in cities. is really really focusing on the spot of 3 miles and less, right? And so scooters are, as we're seeing, whether it's in Chicago with this pilot or here in Atlanta, we're just seeing an incredible number of people, not just in bustling downtown areas, but people that need that connectivity to transit. People that are living in transportation deserts have that ability to get to the bus stop or get to the L or get to places that was very difficult before, either long walks. It's opening up all new economic development opportunities. Small businesses are seeing more customers. So it's having an incredible effect. And so, as far as the policies are concerned, right? I mean, I think one of the things we've seen is, first of all, scooters are the #1 form of shared micromobility in the U.S. after 1 year. NACDO study showed, we had 38.6 million rides after 1 year. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So it shows you that demand is there. And so in order to meet that demand, there's a few things, right? Like, one of the biggest hindrance to growth is caps. In some cities, very low caps, slow incremental growth when we're trying to service an entire city. I mean, that's what we hear a lot from. One of the things that we're hearing, the Chicago pilot's going great. Like any new city, there's a lot of education that goes on. There's a lot of discussions around safety. So there's a lot of issues to address. But nonetheless, people really want affordable, accessible, environmentally friendly transportation. So, we see that in trying to grow that out, so that way we can have that ability to reach people. And then, so in addition to that, obviously we can talk more about parking and infrastructure, but those are obviously key issues as well.
Thank you, Brendan. So, amid e-scooters and e-bikes and docked bike sharing and dockless vehicle sharing and the transportation network companies, all of the new ways of getting people and things around cities, we're also coming to grips or really beginning to grapple in a different way with the realization that our transportation systems haven't served everyone as well as they could. Here at Smart Cities Atlanta and in other conversations across the world, really, we're looking at the equity and accessibility and capabilities and affordability of transit in a whole new way. And I think with the rise of scooters and bikes and new modes, we're realizing that there are some gaps in the system that we may not have seen, which raises some really critical policy priorities. The subtitle of this panel is Mitigating Risk Through Practical Policies. And I think some of the other panels over the last couple of days they've hit on the risks. We're not going to talk as much about the risks as what cities and the new mobility providers are doing to manage these risks and really drive towards a more sustainable, effective, efficient transportation system. And it's clear that no two cities are approaching new mobility the same way. Neil Kleiman earlier this morning talked about mobility in cities as the Wild West right now. Dr. Bernice King on Wednesday evening in the panel talked about the need for balance in not just making technical or technology-driven decisions, but focusing on human, people, resident-centered policies and practices in cities. To me, it feels a little bit like the fairy tale about Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where whether it's the chair, the porridge, or the bed, we have cities out there that are too hard in their policy prescriptions, that really throttle and prohibit some of the innovation and some of the accessibility that new modes offer. On the other end, we have cities that are too soft, where it looks like someone left their toys all over the yard with toppled scooters, or where you have gridlock at the curbs as the drama of the transportation system is playing out. So with the remainder of our time, I'd really like to tap into your expertise on specific policy areas with the goal of searching for just right. How do we find the right balance in our policies to govern and set the rules of the game for the transportation system? So starting out, we talked a little bit about coverage and ensuring access. In the city of Chicago's scooter pilot, for example, we have priority zones. Alderman Villegas and Colin and Brandon, Could you talk about the policies and how do we get to just right in making sure that people have access to new mobility services?
Yeah, thank you. So I was very adamant during the pilot program that my ward, my area, be in that pilot program, given the fact that we do not have the divvy bikes in our area. And the reason why we don't have those divvy bikes, as I mentioned before, public transportation lines are good. However, the investments in bike lanes haven't come that far west. And so we want to make sure that as constituents take a look at using different modes of transportation, we want to make sure they're doing it in a safe way. And so Chicago has made some huge investments, especially in the central business district area, where they're identifying bike lanes. And we even have this one area that we call the hipster highway, that you have thousands of people on bicycles. And it's pretty cool because to see every mode of transportation at 8 o'clock in the morning, you've got your bus, you've got your vehicle, scooters, everything. It's skateboards. It's pretty cool. But the lack of investments in certain areas has prohibited the expansion of divvy bikes. And so when the pilot program was introduced, I wanted to make sure that my constituents had that opportunity to take a look at that mode of transportation as an alternative. Specifically, since the miles of travel for some of the constituents to go to nearby stores are less than 3 miles. So we figured that was a good opportunity. So we're looking at, we've done tons of investments through infrastructure to create those paths for e-bikes, e-scooters, et cetera. And I think that we're going to continue to do that. But we do need to make sure that communities are not left out. And as a result, we were very successful in Chicago getting some billions of dollars in a capital bill. And there's money that's been allocated specifically to deal with identifying and putting forward roads for bicycles, e-scooters, et cetera.
Colin or Brandon, in light of these public policy goals, how are you approaching accessibility and access throughout cities?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the exciting benefits of dockless mobility products is that you don't have to have an upfront investment in fixed infrastructure in order to start operating. And so, particularly if cities are looking to address past inequities in areas of the city that have been neglected and haven't received the benefits of past infrastructure investments, or happen to be far from a transit station or are not well served by legacy modes, then I think dockless mobility has a role to play. It's not going to erase those inequities overnight, obviously, but I think it's a favorable starting point as cities are looking to address those realities. One of the impulses that we see cities bring to the regulatory conversation a lot is, and Brandon touched on this earlier, are supply caps. And I understand where that impulse comes from. It's a way of kind of addressing head-on the toys scattered in the schoolyard problem that we're all familiar with. I think one of the downsides of that, though, is that if those caps are too aggressive and too rigid, it can prevent companies from having confidence that there will eventually be the density required to make the business really work and integrate well with the existing transportation system. And so as one step towards the kind of Goldilocks just right scenario you described, I think cities looking to put caps in place, if they're absolutely dead set on that, first of all, we'd like to have a chance to have a conversation with them to pursue collaborative innovation around whether that's really the right idea. But if they decide they want to go in that direction, I would encourage them to reward good behavior on the part of companies by allowing them to quickly grow past those caps, and in exchange for demonstrated compliance with rules around safety, around equity, around response time to complaints from residents, et cetera, be rewarded with an increase in that cap so that they can grow and have a continued shared stake in success in the city's pilot or permit offering. I think that's one sensible approach that cities ought to take a close look at. Washington, D.C. has done that. I don't know that it's a perfect model to replicate, but I think there's some potential there.
Yeah, and I think Colin was, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what he's saying there. I think some of the other things, in addition to, rewarding that, either good behavior, being really kind of forward thinking. Obviously one of the big topics people want to talk about, and obviously the number one concern is safety, right? So developing the right safety policies in place. So you not only need the right education, but that's to the Alderman's point, that's where the conversation around things like protected bike lanes and having the right infrastructure is important. So as we continue to see more and more demand from consumers, right, we need to have the right policy prescriptions, whether that's at the caps or whether that's around where you can ride. And that's where kind of we now need to be thinking about what does kind of the new streetscape look like in cities. And so as we've seen, as we've surveyed, I mean, 60% of people that we've surveyed said, if there are protected bike lanes, they're going to feel more comfortable. They're going to want to ride scooters more or another form of micromobility. And I think that's going to be an important prescription because the number one reason of as we've seen for any accidents or incidents are really cars. Cars have been the biggest issue, and not having the right infrastructure makes people, especially as they are starting to learn to ride, a little uneasy at times if there aren't, let's say, if there aren't bike lanes, whether it's just a regular bike lane with some paint or something that makes them feel more comfortable. And we've seen time and time again, you're going to relieve any sidewalk issues. The other policy thing I'll just bring up is around parking. Again, that's as we've seen, every city is focusing on these issues differently. It's a bit of a hodgepodge that we have to operate in. But we're seeing some cities kind of think about how do we reimagine parking, because you can fit 10 scooters in a parking space. So how do we then take that and develop the right policies that are going to help our streetscapes and alleviate kind of some of those congestion issues and sidewalk issues?
Thank you. Another of the big risks we hear about from new mobility modes is eroding public transit ridership. In many of our big cities, the trains and the buses are the core of the transportation system. But if we peel off riders of those systems and are forced to cut services, what are we left with, and what happens to that mandate to provide mobility? Given what you've shared about building multimodal networks and integrating new mobility across the system, how do we allow new mobility to thrive while still protecting core public transit services?
I'll speak to Uber's experience here. We're one of the product innovations I'm the most excited about is our integration with public transit. So we're working with cities around the world to allow public transit timetable information to be displayed in the Uber app. So if someone's opening up the Uber app, they're not necessarily opening up the app to request a ride in a car. They're understanding up front the options available to them to get from A to B in that city. And a big part of encouraging transit ridership is making sure people have the confidence that the train is going to arrive when they want it to, and that they're not going to be at risk of missing an appointment or the start of the workday. So having that information surfaced to them with walking directions to the stop, and then being able to incorporate that with other modes bookable through the Uber app, for us is one step in that direction. The other thing is people are naturally they're naturally or organically using micromobility products to connect to transit stops. I'm sure Brandon has many examples of this. The one I'll offer is in Wellington, New Zealand, where we start the day deploying about 100 of the 200 scooters we're allowed to operate in the city at the main transit stop in the middle of town. And between 8 and 9, all those scooters are gone because people are riding them to their office or to their first appointment of the day. And then they're redeployed back to that station for kind of the second wave of that morning rush, and they all end up there at the end of the day in the afternoon for the PM rush because people are incorporating this into their routines. And I think that's one of the most exciting phenomena we're seeing in this space is people, you can just see that the demand is there to get through the city in ways that are more sustainable, more enjoyable than what's been available to them to date.
Alderman Villegas,
Yeah.
do you think that's enough, or do you worry about the health and feasibility of public transit in the face of these new modes?
I see these new modes of transportation as just another tool in the toolbox of the consumer deciding how he or she is going to get to work. And there may be a time when you want to go down in public transportation or on the L, but then there may be a nice day where it's 80 degrees and a nice breeze, and you might want to take a scooter or an e-bike as an option just to enjoy those types of diversity within the transportation arena. So I don't see it, I see it as a tool within the toolbox of getting people from point A to point B. And I think transportation, public transportation, the fact that Uber is allowing consumers to take a look at whether public transportation is an option, I think it's pretty cool because all these companies have all this data, and they're beginning to share it with us, and it helps us out as a municipality because that allows us to determine how we're going to invest in infrastructure, which ways that we should be moving in, and so we appreciate that type of partnership.
I mean, if we're going to think about how we're going to get to this kind of new wave, I mean, collaborating directly with public transportation and with agencies and cities is going to be crucial, right? Because we're starting to partner with transit agencies right now because we've always seen scooters as a complement, not a replacement, and so we're getting a lot of questions around the integration with technology. So they have, as the Alderman mentioned, much better data. So they can look at that data and make much better decisions. We can work with them and say, okay, so we know where we should be placing more scooters because that's a critical point to get to public transit. I mean, some cities like Washington, D.C., I mean, we're seeing, I think about 25% of rides are going directly to public transportation. They're not just necessarily going from point A to point B, but they're really filling that, last mile gap.
Well, we know that urban transportation provides the circulatory system and in some ways the central nervous system of our cities. This couldn't be more important. And I really appreciate the conversation and the expertise you bring to the conversation about practical approaches to managing a functional system. We've talked about multi-mobility platforms and integration across modes. We've talked a little bit about outcome-based regulation. Instead of trying to cap the inputs to the system, let's govern and develop policy that speaks to the outputs. And we've spoken, maybe most importantly, about that need to put residents at the center of our transportation systems. So as we wrap up this conversation, I'd just like to quickly go down the line. Since we know new cities are launching new mobility platforms almost every day, what's the one thing you would like to see the next city to bring in new mobility modes think about as they determine how to regulate that system?
I wish there was one thing. There's a number of things. I'll say it this way. All right, I only have 12 seconds, so I can't really go at it. But I think that collaboration and showcasing how the business succeeds, the transit connectivity and the caps argument is going to be one that's important.
Alderman Villegas, I'll give you the last word, but Brandon, what's the one thing you'd like to see cities consider?
I'd like them to think carefully about developing smart policies around data sharing, which, if not handled carefully, I think can pose enormous risks to consumer privacy. And I would like cities to start with an understanding of the individual trip data, knowing that I took a scooter or a bike to a mental health provider or to my lawyer's office or any other sensitive area. That is not information that cities need in order to make smart transportation planning decisions. There's a lot of data that all of our companies have that can inform those choices. We want to work with them to find them, but individual trip data is an extremely dangerous area for cities to go down, and I'd encourage them to engage early with privacy groups before developing policies in this space.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, I just think it's important that as new modes of transportation come online and cities are thinking about expanding, that there be that collaboration between the private sector and the public sector to determine ultimately what's best for the constituents.
Well, once again, thank you to Colin Tooze, to Alderman Gilbert Villegas, and to Brandon Pollock. Appreciate the conversation, and I know that you're leaving our audience with a lot to think about in this brave new world of urban mobility. Thank you.